What's up, everybody? This is Aaron Marshall. This is the Present Day Saint. It's good to be back with you. It's been a little bit since I've been able to record. Lots of cool things happening here with the ministry out here in Utah. A friend of mine, David Halevi, who's been on the podcast before, we did do a podcast called The Jew and the Gentile, and he's been on the Present Day Saint before. But he is in the process of moving to Israel, and he is hopefully going to get there pretty soon. And they're going to be doing some mission trips to mission trips to Israel, similar to what we're doing out here to Utah. And so he was here for 10 days, and we recorded like 30 some videos that we're going to put together for a curriculum for mission trips that we're going to do out here to Utah. If you're interested at all in learning more about how you can come out here to Utah on a mission trip and learn how to do evangelism and all the things we're going to be doing, certainly let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. I think we've got at least 2, maybe 3 scheduled for next spring. And then hopefully once coronavirus gets out of here and things get back to normal, if that ever happens, then we're able to ramp those up, and maybe we'll be doing even 10 a year or so. 10 or 15, or who knows, maybe 20 a year. Week-long trips. We're doing all kinds of cool stuff, lots of evangelism. So hope that you will consider that. Maybe that'll be something that you'd be interested in coming out and checking out. So what I wanted to do today is just continue. We've done now 2 episodes in our classical apologetics series. First, we just talked about what apologetics is, what it isn't, what it can do, what it can't do, and some of those kind of things. Then we talked about faith, the nature of faith last time. And this time I just wanted to talk about worldviews. And we'll talk about that just kind of briefly. It's not we'll talk about it briefly, and then we'll just keep moving on in this series. So the question is, if I ask you, what is your worldview? What does that even mean? What does it mean to have a worldview? Well, first of all, some people say, well, I don't have a worldview. Well, guess what? That's your worldview, because everyone has a worldview. Worldview is just an explanation of why things are the way they are. And everyone has a worldview. Everyone has an explanation of why things are the way that they are. The question is, do you have the true worldview? Do you have the correct worldview? We're not talking about trying on different clothes and just picking the one that we like. Right? We're talking about finding the reality that is true, finding the worldview that is true to reality. Now, in many ways, you already have this, right? Because it's reality. So many of you have a worldview that actually doesn't correspond with the way you live your life. In other words, reality is the true worldview. And that's what all of us live in. We live in a reality. Now, what happens, though, is many of us, are denying certain things about objective reality in order to try to make sense of a false worldview. And what we can do in this session is just give some tests, some things to think about in regards to your worldview, to start thinking about, okay, am I seeing things the way that reality actually is? Because the true worldview must explain adequately all of the pieces of the puzzle we call reality. Now, because you live in reality, you are going to operate in that. But if your worldview can't explain it, then there's going to be what we call cognitive dissonance. In other words, you're going to be living and acting in a way that's different from what you profess to believe. And so what we're trying to figure out is, what is the true worldview, and then match the way we think about these things up with actual reality. So all the major worldviews are attempting to answer basically, the similar questions, and different people look at different questions that worldviews try to answer. But just let's look at 5 of them: origin, identity, meaning, morality, destiny. Okay, so think about this. Origin, where did we come from? Let's just think about let's just look at the Christian worldview, the evangelical Christian worldview versus the LDS worldview, and then maybe even the naturalism view, or atheistic worldview. We'll look at atheistic Darwinian materialism. Okay, origins, where do we come from? The evangelical Christian view is that God created everything out of nothing, that we are special creations made in the image of God, which doesn't mean we look like God. It just means that we are made, we're imagers of God, as Michael Heiser would say, that we're to reflect God, but rationality, we're able to worship. Those some of the things it means made in God's image, but we are special creations by God. In the LDS worldview, there are these what do they call them? These eternal not intelligences, these intelligences that have just always existed. And so there's these intelligences that have always existed. And what God has done is sort of recombined matter into form you. But it's a very different view than a biblical or evangelical Christian view. Then what about on the atheistic worldview? Where do we come from? We just came from, you're all evolved pond scum, or you're all just stardust, right? Because we all came from the same stuff, and it wasn't anything. There was no purpose behind it. It was just blind chance or natural selection acting on genetic mutations, or whatever they want to say. So who are we? What's our identity? Identity for us as evangelical Christians is that we are made in God's image, right? That we are imagers of God, as we just said. The identity, you would say in Mormonism, I guess you could potentially say that, but not really, because God is the one who formed us, yes, but our goal is to become gods. And so it seems like we want to become just like him, just become like Heavenly Father. So we are, as evangelical Christians, we believe that we are made to glorify God, not to become God. LDS would say that no, that we are made out of this kind of reformed, these intelligence that have always existed, but we're made to become God. In the atheistic materialistic worldview, we're just evolved pond scum. We are blind chance. There's nothing great about us. In fact, they would say it's you're a speciesist if you somehow elevate humanity over other species, which is insane. Why are we here, right? Meaning, what's the purpose of being here? Again, as for evangelical Christians, we'd say we are made to know God and to glorify Him. Right, that's the purpose of what we're here. We're to know God and to glorify Him. As for the LDS, their ultimate purpose is exaltation, to become God. Very different worldview. And on the atheistic materialistic worldview, we're here because of natural selection acting on genetic mutations. There's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no real any of that. Morality. This is super interesting. So morality is just the question of how should we live. On the evangelical worldview, we would say that God, since God is the creator and sustainer of everything, that morality is a reflection of His nature. And so the way in which we should live is the way in which He has designed us to live, because morality is a reflection of God, right? Because it's a reflection of His nature, His unchanging nature. On the LDS worldview, this is something that I'd love to explore in future podcasts. There is no objective morality, right? I mean, you could say Heavenly Father has decided that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, but it's just because He just decided it. And in other worlds where there's other gods, other things could be right and other things could be wrong. There are no objective moral truths that exist, because if you try to say that they've always existed, well, those aren't the kinds of moral truths are not descriptive, they're prescriptive, and you need a mind, you need something for them to exist. And that's why I would say that the true worldview says that these objective moral truths reside in God's nature. But on the LDS view, since matter and these intelligences are all that existed, there is no grounding for ultimate morality. And I think it's a huge problem for the LDS worldview. Now, on the atheistic worldview, there is no objective morality, right? Because you're just evolved pond scum, you're just dancing to your DNA. So there is no such thing as objective right or wrong. They're just stuff that's happening. Reality is descriptive, not prescriptive. And then destiny, where are we going? On the evangelical worldview, that since we are made to know God and to glorify Him, we are either going to be with Him forever in the new heavens, the new earth, if we've bowed our knee and recognized our need for a Savior and trusted Jesus, or we will be separated from Him forever in hell, because we will have to pay the price for our sins. So that's the evangelical or biblical, I would say, worldview. On the LDS worldview, almost everybody who's ever existed, except for the devil and a third of the angels, and then any apostate Mormons, those are the only ones that are going to go to outer darkness. Everybody else will live in 3 levels of heaven. But the ultimate goal for the LDS is godhood, exaltation. So to become God, which I would argue is blasphemous. And then for the atheist, the ultimate death, where are we going? Nowhere, right? We're just going to become worm food. You live, you die, that's it. It's over. That's it. And so you can see that different religious views, and I would include atheism in that religious view, give very different answers to these worldview questions. And so they all can't be right, which we'll talk about when we look at the nature of truth, probably next podcast. But all of these worldviews can't be right because they contradict each other. So what we have to do as we begin evaluating worldviews is we have to begin to look at evidence to try to figure out which worldview is correct. And we could put forth different worldviews as hypothesis, right? And then we would evaluate the evidence to determine if it's true. So we would evaluate the evidence of whether Christianity is true, or Mormonism is true, or atheism is true. And we need to look at all the possible worldviews, not just those three, right? We need to look at all of them, and we need to try to figure out if it's possible to figure out which worldview is true, because I don't want to believe something that's false, and I hope you don't either. And so we're trying to figure out, we're trying to figure out essentially which worldview is true. Maybe it's a theistic worldview, which means there's a personal God who created everything, right? Maybe it's a pantheistic worldview who says that God is everything. Maybe it's an atheistic worldview, which is no God at all, right? Maybe it's polytheism, like the Mormonism. I mean, there's lots of, maybe it's a deistic worldview where God is just the guy who sets the clock in motion and then lets it go. Maybe it's a dualistic worldview where there's yin and there's yang, and there's good and there's evil, and they're kind of vying for everything. There's lots of different kinds of worldviews, right? And so we want to try to figure out, if possible, what is the correct worldview. That's what we do by looking at the evidence. And that's what we'll do over that's what this series will be on, is a classical apologetics argument. So let's look at just a couple things. This comes from Doug Groothuis's book called Christian Apologetics, on just a worldview hypothesis evaluation. In other words, we're putting out worldviews as hypothesis to be examined. And so what are some of the tests that we can use to figure out, to start examining worldviews? Okay. And so he said the first one is, does it explain what it ought to explain, right? Does it give an explanation for important aspects of life? In other words, does a worldview explain everything that needs to be explained? If your worldview can't explain everything that needs to be explained, then that's actually good evidence that the worldview can't be true. So, for instance, I would argue that the LDS cannot explain ultimate reality, because they do not believe in an uncaused first cause. There is, but they believe that matter and these intelligences have existed for forever. And we'll demonstrate when we look at arguments for God's existence that cannot be the case. There has to be some uncaused first cause that's organizing everything. Because even if you say that that's true, then when they say that God organized those intelligences, well, you can't. How did God become organized intelligence? There has to be something or someone that is the ultimate first cause. Naturalism can't explain why something came from nothing. And so if your worldview can explain that, then that's a good indication that your worldview can't be true. Now, Christianity says that that God is the uncaused first cause, which is a good explanation for how things came to be. Now, it would have to be for all. We look at all facets of the worldview, and we would ask that question: does your worldview explain what it ought to explain? And if it can't, then that can't be a good worldview. It can't be the true worldview, because true worldview would have to explain all of reality. Okay. All right. What about test number 2? Internal logical consistency in the essential elements of the worldview. Now, this would be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. In other words, part of what it part of the test for a true worldview is that it's internally consistent. But just because it's internally consistent doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? I could come with a lie that's internally consistent, but it's just not true. So we would say that internal consistency is a necessary test, right? But we'd have to look at other factors, right? But if it's internally inconsistent, then that would be a sufficient indicator that a worldview is false. In other words, if it's internally inconsistent, then the worldview can't be true. If it's contradictory, the worldview can't be true. And I think certainly there's tons of things that are contradictory within certainly within an atheistic worldview, or certainly a humanistic worldview. Maybe some people try to, I think the LDS worldview is inconsistent, because I think that they are, I don't think that many of the teachings, right? So you could look at the Book of Mormon in certain passages where it argues that there is only one God and he has always existed and he doesn't change. And then you look at Doctrines and Covenants when it talks about there's multiple gods and he's changing and a man became a God. So it's not internally consistent. There's discrepancies, right? You could look at, did God say that we should, that man should be polygamous, that black people could not have the priesthood, and then all of a sudden change his mind in, the late 1800s and in the 1970s on those two issues? Well, God can't change. So in other words, if God can change his mind, then how do we know that God can't change his mind on anything? So it seems like that those aren't being consistent. You other got problems if the curse of black skin was on the Lamanites, and that curse has been lifted, so to speak, then why do black people still have black skin? Right? And they've changed the text where it used to say whites them and delights them, and now it says pure and delights them, because I would argue that their worldview is internally inconsistent, which is a sufficient indicator that the worldview is false. The LDS worldview is false. Okay, what about test number 3? And these are just things that you're going to evaluate as you look at different worldviews. Number 3, so this actually moves beyond logical consistency to what we call coherence. Okay, so do the essential propositions of a worldview, do they cohere? Are they tightly interrelated and conceptually linked? In other words, does everything cohere together into one system of thinking? Now, again, coherence is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the truth of a worldview. I mean, if a worldview's essential propositions are coherent, then there's a good reason to believe it's true. But if they're incoherent, then it can't be true. And again, I think this idea of these eternal intelligences and eternal matter is incoherent because it just doesn't work philosophically. I think the idea of eternal families is incoherent because it is, and maybe even say logically inconsistent, because if you're on the LDS worldview, because if I become a god, the idea is that me and my wife would have our own planet, would be with our family forever. Okay. But then if my son also becomes a god, or my daughter, one of my sons becomes a god, or one of my daughters marries a guy who becomes a god, right? Well, now they're on their own planet. So I'm not with them forever. So the Christian worldview actually turns out to be the only worldview in which families are forever, because you are with your family forever in the new heavens and new earth if they're all believers. But the LDS worldview seems to be incoherent and inconsistent on those teaching, and there's others as well. So again, the question is your worldview consistent, and is it coherent? Okay, all right, so test 4, factual adequacy. Easy for me to say. Factual adequacy. This concerns the historical and empirical dimensions of life. In other words, is it factually accurate? Does it say things that are actually true? So for instance, the Christian worldview, right? We would say that there were the nation of Israel, that they really did exist. Jesus really did exist. He died on a cross. He rose from the dead. These are historical events, okay? And so the greater extent in which the worldview's essential factual claims can be established, in different scientific, empirical, historical ways, the greater likelihood that worldview is true. Now, compare that with the evidence, and I use that in air quotes, for the LDS worldview, right? I mean, we have no evidence of this nation, that this civilization that existed in the Americas, right? That was supposedly here from people that came over from Israelites. We know that the Indians that are supposed to be Lamanites, we know that they do not have Semitic blood in them. We know that, again, there's no archaeological evidence for any of this. All this stuff that we should expect to find. Historically, there's lots of problems with the first vision. Well, if you listen to the podcast we did with Rob Bowman, you'll understand that. Just all this problems historically, factually, scientifically. How can these eternal intelligences exist forever? And I think philosophically, we can show that there has to be an uncaused first cause, which the LDS worldview denies. All these reasons why we shouldn't believe that it's true. compared to Christianity, where we look at these historical tests and we can demonstrate that Christianity has been proven correct every single time it's been tested historically, right? And certainly we'll look at the resurrection, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and we find that it's overwhelming. So, other worldviews that, like, if your worldview says that the universe is eternal, well, there's good evidence, both philosophically and scientific, which we'll look at, which demonstrates that the universe isn't eternal, that it came into existence. And so, if your worldview says that the universe is eternal, then it can't be true, right? And I think that's probably, again, one of the problems with the LDS worldview. Okay. What about test number 5? This is just the idea that, can your worldview be affirmed without philosophical hypocrisy? And what do I mean by this? Okay, certain people, New Agers, maybe even Hindus, that deny evil. They deny objective evil, right? They just say it's an illusion. Well, it just seems like you just have to go to again, philosophical hypocrisy to claim that, because we all recognize that certain things are evil. And so, you have to, the essential parts of your worldview have to be able to be affirmed philosophically without being a hypocrite. And, if you can't, then you're rationally disqualified as your worldview being true. And again, I think there's so many philosophical problems with the LDS worldview that disqualify it from being the true worldview, that don't also apply to evangelical Christianity, because the same problems you don't have the same problems there. Okay, what about test number 6? Intellectual and cultural fruitfulness. And by this we mean that the worldview should motivate its followers to embrace and master reality with confidence and energy. And again, this is a necessary but not sufficient one. But it's just saying that, what are the fruits of your worldview? When you think about atheism, I mean, the fruits of the atheistic worldview in the 20th century are the bloodiest century in the history of the world. Now people say, well, you just count the bodies, China and Russia, Yugoslavia. I mean, they'll say, well, they weren't doing that in the name of atheism. No, but it was the atheistic worldview that allowed them to think this way, right? And you look at, and if people just have this false idea about Christianity. If you want to understand the reality of the way in which Christianity has influenced all of the world, I implore you to pick up any of the books by Rodney Stark on that issue. I think one's called How Christianity Saved the World, or something like that. But Rodney Stark has written on this, and basically just showing that the Christian worldview is responsible for so much, if not all, of the fruitfulness, because it's true. Right. And again, I would say, look at some of the fruitfulness or the lack of in the LDS worldview, with polygamy, with the denial of African Americans in the priesthood and those kind of things. And you just hasn't been fruitful. Right. And I think have they done lots of good things? Sure. Nobody's saying that they haven't. But the ultimate fruit of that is, I would say, is not good. And then I think lastly, we'll do 2 more actually real quick. Test 7 would say, this radical ad hoc readjustment, right, would be a negative criterion for testing worldviews. In other words, if a worldview substantially alters its essential claims in light of counter evidence, then it loses rational justification. And I would say this happens to LDS all the time, right? They denied that Joseph Smith used the seer stone in the hat to translate the Book of Mormon forever. And when they had the evidence, and then finally they say, oh, actually, never mind, we were wrong about that. They said that that black skin was a curse from God, and denied them the priesthood. And they said, oh yeah, never mind. They said that polygamy was required to get into exaltation, then said, oh yeah, never mind, we deny that. I mean, it just doesn't, you just can't, it just doesn't, the evidence seems to point against it. I mean, you could argue the same thing with karma in Hinduism and Buddhism, right? I mean, how does it operate automatically? But yet we need spiritual agents to accomplish the work. I mean, you can't have both sides of it, right? I mean, how does karma even get started in the first place? In other words, what sins were the first people paying for, right? Well, they believe in this kind of loop, which again is philosophically impossible, and so again, that would be a negative test for that worldview. And then finally, look, test 8, all things being equal, simpler explanations are just preferable to unnecessarily complex ones. So not simple in the point of being simplistic, say, oh, well, atheism is simpler than God. No, just saying that if we can get to the evidence with a simple explanation, right? We don't need to expand it even ever. We don't need to expand it further. Again, we'll look at the evidence, and the evidence helps us to determine that. But just on the whole, simpler explanations are better than complex ones when you're evaluating the evidence. Now, if you apply each of these 8 tests to Christianity and its rivals, a cumulative case argument is formed. And I believe that gives a very, very strong positive case for the Christian worldview, and it actually eliminates every other worldview, including the LDS worldview, if you're willing to look at it objectively. And so the approach we're going to advocate is that we're going to look at each of the essential aspects of the Christian worldview one by one, and then give you good reasons why we should hold to that worldview, and then also show you in demonstrating the truth claims of Christianity why all other worldviews are false. Now, it is important that just because you're a Christian, a biblical evangelical Christian, does not mean you have a Christian worldview. So here's a quote from a guy named Richard Mouw. I'm going to read it's a long quote, but I think it's important to help us kind of frame why this is an important thing to wrestle through. He says, I'm concerned about the way, and he's talking about this conversation he had with, he's talking about this conversation that he had with a young girl who held very conflicting and contradictory worldviews and also professed to be a Christian. And he says, I'm concerned about the way she seems to be piecing together a set of convictions to guide her life. While I did not take the opportunity to quiz her about the way in which she makes room in her psyche for an endorsement of both witchcraft and the gospel's resurrection narratives, I doubt that Heather subscribes to both views of reality, that's Wicca and Christianity, in their robust versions. She is placing fragments of worldviews side by side without thinking about their incompatibility. And it is precisely the fact that these disconnected cognitive bits coexist in her consciousness that causes my concern. Here's a sense in which Heather is a microcosm, or you could say a micro chaos of the larger culture. And what he means by that is that most of us, we don't set out to determine our worldview in this sort of systematic way. We just pick it up. We always teach you pick up your worldview kind of like you pick up the cold, right? It's caught more than it's taught. And you pick up your worldview by the things you read, by the social media you consume, by the people you hang out with, by just all the things around you. And so most people, and I'm sure this is true of me in some areas, obviously if I knew what it was, I'd change it, but I don't. Most, I would say everybody on some level has elements of the worldview that are contradictory, that don't cohere, that are false. And yet you're holding you're holding this worldview together because you're not critically thinking through it. And so when we talk to the LDS people a lot, when we bring up any of this stuff, ultimately they'll go back to, well, it's just about faith, which is why we did that podcast on the nature of faith before this, because that's not what faith isn't believing things in spite of evidence, right? It's faith is trusting in the one who's proven themselves trustworthy. And if your worldview isn't true, then it can't be trustworthy, right? And if your worldview isn't true, then it can't give you purpose and meaning and hope and all the reasons that people seem to want to believe something. No, the only way your worldview can give you those things is if it's actually true. The only worldview we should believe in is the one that's true. And we should have the courage to examine all the evidence and go where the evidence leads in regards to the one true worldview. And yet so many times when I talk to either LDS or even evangelical Christians, they'll just say the evidence doesn't matter, right? It's about my personal feelings and all that stuff. And that's what we're trying to challenge the way we think about that. We're trying to say the only thing to think about in regards to your worldview is it true? Because if it's not true, it doesn't matter if you think it's giving you all these psychological benefits, because those are actually false, because it's actually, the worldview is actually not true. And look, no one's saying there aren't there are difficult issues within every worldview, sure. So I'm not saying the Christian worldview is just easy to defend because there's no problems, right? But what I'm saying is that many of the problems with the Christian worldview come down to intellectual objections, which we'll answer, but some of them come down to just emotional obstacles, right? I just don't want it to be true, or I want it to be true. So if I'm talking to an LDS person and they say, I don't care what evidence you give me, right? I'm convinced that the LDS is true. I don't care about the evidence, right? Then that's fine, but just understand that you're basically saying it's an emotional decision, not an intellectual. And many of the LDS actually celebrate that. They'll say, "I'm glad I made the decision with my heart and not my head." And I implore you to think better, because your heart is, Jeremiah 17:9, your heart is desperately wicked. Who can trust it, right? Our feelings lie to us all the time. We have to have good reasons to believe these things. And so we want to think through this, the most important question in life. We want to think through it critically, and we want to come to the right conclusions on these, and whatever that takes us. And I think this should be, as we sort of finish, I think that should be the goal, is wherever that leads us, do you have the courage to go there? So if you became convinced that and you're a Mormon, and you became convinced that the LDS is not true, would you walk away? And if you're a Christian and you became convinced that Christianity wasn't true, would you walk away? I think the answer has to be yes. The only reason I should be a Christian is because it's true. Now, certainly I'm convinced that Christianity is true, and I think the evidence is on our side. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a Christian. But so many times I talk to people, and they're not willing to go where the evidence leads, and you have to decide that. So that's a volitional reason why you're unwilling, to do that. And maybe it's psychological, maybe it's emotional, maybe whatever. But you're just saying, I'm not willing to go where the evidence leads. Well, then you're admitting that you don't care about the truth. And look, no one's saying this is an easy conversation. No one's saying that if you came to believe that your worldview was false, that leaving that and going to the true worldview wouldn't be very hard. Nobody's saying that. It's just saying that that's the only honest thing you can do, right? And so what we see a lot, though, and maybe this is one place to finish it. What we see a lot is people walking away from the LDS and becoming atheistic agnostic. The problem is, you still have to answer all those worldview questions now within the atheistic agnostic worldview, and you can't. So you're just as much a problem in the atheistic agnostic worldview as you are in the LDS worldview. The only worldview, I'm convinced, that answers all of these tests and that can explain all of reality is the biblical Christian worldview, because that's the only worldview that's true. And that's what we'll try to do in this series, is trying to lay out the evidence for that so that you can decide for yourself. But if you're not willing to go where the evidence leads, it doesn't matter how much evidence I give you, because you've admitted the evidence doesn't matter. So I know that's a lot to think about, and hopefully that has been hopefully you're thinking about it. Hopefully you're listening. If you know somebody that would be benefit from listening to this, please pass this on to them, and hopefully they'll listen to the whole series, and then they can decide for themselves what they think about the truth claims of the Christian worldview. If you like what you're hearing on this podcast on the Present Day Saint, please like and subscribe to the podcast. We need people to just right now go on, like us, and then subscribe to us. I'd love to see our subscribers double, and by the end of the year. That's the goal. Let's double the subscribers by the end of the year. So if that's you and you're not a subscriber right now, would you subscribe? It would help us out tremendously, and hopefully this can continue to be a benefit to you, and you can pass it on to people that you know and you love. So again, thank you for listening to this episode of the Present Day Saint. Thanks for continuing to wrestle through these hard issues with us. And we will continue to hopefully put out really good content, and hopefully God will use this content in people's lives to bring them to salvation, or for believers to get some confidence to go out and to evangelize, to be able to share the good news of Jesus with friends that either are LDS or atheist, or they're not Christian. So again, please like and subscribe to the podcast. It helps us out tremendously, and we would love if you would consider doing that. But until next time, this is Aaron Marshall, the Present Day Saint, signing off.